Peter Parker eagerly visits the 4th annual Tomorrow Exposition being held here in New York. A remarkable new device from Quark Enterprises allows Peter to levitate into the sky. He thinks to himself that he didn't even like flying when he had Captain Universe powers, and he was in control of those. But luckily, the test ends pretty quickly and Peter is returned to the ground. In spite of Peter's misgivings, the technology is remarkable, and Peter is blown away by some of the amazing experiments and inventions on display here at the Expo. He is shown a drone that is capable of automatic insect pest control. The Expo itself is using this new system to keep the building safe from any unwanted insects. The same inventor has also developed a robotic dog capable of warding off human intruders. Peter is amazed by all of this, but realizes the Expo is about to close for the day. He has himself go find a phone to call his wife, and let Mary Jane know he's going to be running late. Meanwhile, not far from here, Scott Lang arrives at the Expo incredibly late. The cab from the airport got caught in traffic. He didn't even have time to bring his luggage to his hotel. And he's still running out of time. While his daughter Cassie is spending some time with relatives, Scott wants to check out some of the cool new experiments at the Expo. He is dismayed to find that the Quark exhibit has already been shut down, the one thing he really wanted to see. He realizes he'll just have to wait for tomorrow to do so. On the other hand, where there's a will, and an Ant-Man, there's a way. Unbeknownst to both heroes, outside of the building, a van pulls up. When security tries to see who they are, the man pulls out a cloth of chloroform, much to the security guard's alarm. A group of terrorists then burst out of the van, heavily armed and armored, and prepared to kill the security guard. The driver of the van gives the guard a simple choice: breathe the chloroform, or stop breathing at all. The terrorists then invade the exposition, intent on stealing the Quark machine and its incredible energy source for themselves. Many countries will pay handsomely to obtain such technology. Over the phone, Peter lets MJ know that he's going to be late. She has a love scene for the drama Secret Hospital being taped tomorrow, and was hoping he could come home and help her rehearse. Mary Jane asks her husband to hurry home, and he promises to do exactly that. Knowing that he can travel home faster as Spider-Man, Peter goes off to find a secret location where he can change. Unbeknownst to both heroes, they change nearby each other into their superhero outfits. When Scott Lang uses the Ant-Man shrinking gas, some of the gas is sucked through the vents and shrinks Spider-Man as well, much to the unwary webhead's alarm. It takes Spider-Man a while to realize what has happened to him, and even longer for him to fully understand the nature of the shrinking gas, and the fact that he still retains his enhanced strength that he would have as a normal-sized Spider-Man. Peter determines this must have something to do with the Quark experiment he participated in earlier, and rushes off to check it out. Scott Lang, meanwhile, is already at the Quark exhibit, examining the technology for himself. While he's deeply impressed, he is surprised when the circuit board he's standing on is suddenly grabbed by the terrorists, as this is the exact piece of technology they're looking for. Ant-Man then gets into battle with this dangerous militia group, growing in size to combat them. However, he suddenly finds himself cornered when 3 of them are successfully able to pull their guns on him when he is normal-sized. Meanwhile, on his way to the Quark exhibit, Spider-Man is attacked by the pest control system deployed at the Expo. It uses a number of devices and gadgets to attempt to grab and kill Spider-Man, but Peter is able to outwit it and use the drone's own momentum against it to smash the thing to bits. However, in doing so, a number of additional drones are deployed, these ones with dart-like projectiles. In spite of nearly being hit many times, Spider-Man is able to lead these flying drones into a fan, destroying them once and for all, only for Peter to encounter the final defensive measure protecting the Expo, the robotic dog. Using his incredible strength, Spider-Man's able to knock this robot's head clean off, and he finally discovers Ant-Man cornered by the terrorists. Spider-Man leaps into action, saving Scott Lang, and together the two of them are able to capture the rest of the terrorists. The police are called in and are able to arrest the militia, while Ant-Man offers Spider-Man a ride out of here on the back of his aunt named Indy. Peter explains what happened to him, and Scott Lang agrees to help Spider-Man grow back to normal, only for the gas to do nothing. Peter finds himself still trapped in a tiny form. Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is my recap and review of the Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 24. So next up in our random reviews looking at Mary Jane's life as a character in the comic books, we are looking at an annual issue, this time the 24th annual from The Amazing Spider-Man. That really speaks to how long the series has been going on, even at this point in 1990, and how much this series has developed and grown since its premiere in the 1960s. A lot has changed since then, and with it, so has the relationship between Mary Jane and Peter Parker. One would hope there'd be a difference by now in the 14 years that have occurred since the last time we've looked at an issue in this series. And indeed, there has been a big change. They are now married. It's a change in dynamic that now reflects a newlywed couple coming up in New York City and dealing with this changing environment. They have their own apartment, which is actually detailed in this annual with a floor plan. A cool detail that I would say is actually the part of the comic that I like the most. It seems simple, but by doing this and giving us a sense of the geography of the physical location of the apartment as well as the interior of the apartment with an actual floor plan, like what one would expect out of any property development, we get a strong sense of what's going on in this series, and we get a strong sense of what to expect in this apartment. Now, they don't live there anymore. This is a bygone era, but it's very cool that there's a sense of this geography and a reference point for artists in the future when dealing with this familiar location. I really like how well defined this apartment is because of this issue. But the meat of this comic, out of the 4 stories that are part of this annual, is the team up between Ant-Man and Spider-Man, if you can call it that. I do love this story, their little adventure in this science expo with Spider-Man dealing with the dynamics of being shrunken down and actually deducing strong aspects of those powers and the fact that he still has his relative strength, even though he's tiny. That makes for a fun little adventure for Spider-Man as he travels through the expo, while Ant-Man deals with a group of interestingly ambiguous terrorists who have elements of German, Russian, and even Arabic ties to them, deliberately making it vague about who they are and just sort of embodying a general sense of them being bad guys without having to really go into any more specifics than that. Given the lighthearted nature and tone of this comic, I think that's appropriate, but it is amusing and feels like a true product of it being in the 1990s. Therefore being a time with the Soviet Union so recently dismantled, practically dismantling around the time period of this comic, I get a sense that writer David Michelinie didn't have a strong idea of what would be a good home country for these generic villains, and therefore he just chose to leave it completely ambiguous. That works for me, and I think it was a funny little detail that really gave the sense of this comic being not about those larger political things and more about Ant-Man and Spider-Man being tiny and trapped in this crazy situation and ultimately working together to figure a way out of it. Also, just as a random aside, I really have to give a shout out to one of my favorite parts of this comic, when the terrorist is just holding a piece of chloroform. Like, normally people force that against someone and make them inhale it. This was a lot more direct of an action. Like, you can either sniff this chloroform or we're going to shoot you. I've never seen that take before, and I really liked it. It was very amusing. I wish there was a little bit more time spent with them actually working together. That's a very small part of this comic. And I am also a little perturbed by the idea of this story ending on a cliffhanger in an annual that has plenty of pages and plenty of room to finish a storyline like this. However, I do and did kind of enjoy the ending just the same, because it's fine all on its own. We don't really need to know what happens to Peter after this, and we know eventually he will be returned to size. It probably has to do with that Quark Enterprises energy that was pumped into Peter at the beginning of this story, making him resistant to growing back to normal or something like that. But regardless of the case, it's a fun little adventure and a fun little twist on the ending, where we'd expect, after all is said and done and the terrorists were defeated and arrested, for Peter to just be returned to normal size and that to be the end of it. It's actually not the case, and they don't know how they're going to resolve this issue, and they don't know how they were going to return Peter to his normal size, and that's a pretty good twist. I only wish that it wasn't being picked up in a different series of Spider-Man comics annual for this year. That feels a little cheap. If it was tying into something that would be picked up in the Amazing Spider-Man series, and therefore it's just an annual tying into its own series and continuing it forward, I think that would be reasonable. But the fact that they're just using this as a sort of means to sell a couple of different Spider-Man annuals at once seems a little bit cheap to me, when we could have easily just cut one of these bonus stories out and included the entire story of Spider-Man and Ant-Man in this particular run. That isn't to say that the bonus stories aren't bad. There's a bonus Ant-Man story written by Tony Isabella that's a lot of fun, a good little solo story, also written by David Michelini and with art by Steve Ditko, so it's definitely worth checking out this comic for no other reason than that. And Sandman has his own story in this comic, which is a lot of fun, and is written by Tom DeFalco, Jim DeMatteis, and then Matt Zach and Don Green do the artwork for that particular one. The main story that we're focusing on here, with artwork by Gil Kane and Rudy Nebres, is pretty good, though I did have some issues. I wish that Scott Lang and Peter Parker were drawn in a more visually distinct way, because aside from the hair, which you can barely tell is blonde on Scott Lang, these two characters look identical outside of their costumes. Thankfully, they don't spend a lot of time out of their costumes, but it is one issue I had with the art that's otherwise fantastic. It's just a classic Spider-Man artwork, it looks great, and really has a strong feeling to it. A feeling that I get almost out of a lot of 1980s Spider-Man art, and that makes sense, because even though this comic was published mid-year of 1990, these decade markers that we often use when describing comic book history aren't these absolute barriers of quality or change in style. Things change slowly, so there's a lot of the 1980s Spider-Man in this comic. And a lot of what would come to define 1990s Spider-Man isn't present here just yet, even if you can kind of see the direction they're going in. Ultimately, though, the timing of this comic doesn't really matter all that much, in that this feels like a pretty timeless story. I would love to see the MCU take a crack at this for one of their movies, either as an Ant-Man movie or a Spider-Man movie. This would make for an excellent and different premise for either character, and would be a fun sort of crossover film that would be an entertaining, light piece, with low stakes but a lot of fun attached to it, and a unique setting for the two characters to rely on their own love of science but also their wits to getting out of the situation. It's the sort of thing that really works based on the strength of the characters in question, and Peter Parker and Scott Lang seem like a really good team together. They both have this sort of scrappy nature to them. These aren't the polished heroes like Superman and Batman or Iron Man and Captain America are. These guys are just sort of doing their best and often barely succeeding when attempting to do so. And so their pairing feels like a very natural fit. The fact that they are both starting this story out late for one thing or another really speaks to, I think, their overall situation and atmosphere around the writing. This wouldn't work as well with Hank Pym as a character. And that's why I think it would work so well for an MCU thing. Paul Rudd and Tom Holland both exemplify these two characters so well that the comedic aspects of these two characters would play off each other nicely, while they're also capable of digging deeper and offering a little bit more than what's actually in this comic. And that's where I think this is a particularly strong candidate for adaptation, because this isn't the perfect storyline. I would like to see more of Spider-Man and Ant-Man more directly interacting with each other, and I think there's lots of room for improvement here in adding a little bit more depth to the villains and offering a little bit more up in terms of the overall plotline. Which isn't to say this comic is bad. For what it sets out to do and what it wants to be, it's good. It's just such a great idea there's room for more here, and I really would like to see that more someday. They have done a very good job at bringing some of the other characters into the solo movies in fun ways. Just look at Captain America Civil War or Thor Ragnarok for a good example of that. But as for this comic, yes, I would definitely recommend it. Between the fact that we're involving major figures in comic book history here, like Steve Ditko, co-creator of Spider-Man, or Tony Isabella, a huge writer that is creator of Black Lightning, among many others, and Tom DeFalco, Jim DeMatteis, and David Michelini, who writes the Spider-Man AntMan crossover. All of these huge names in the history of Spider-Man comics, but just comic books in general. Even though there is a cliffhanger for one of these stories, it's a good read regardless, and there's a lot offered here. So thanks for watching. Next up, we're only going to go a couple years into the future, into 1992. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. If you like Comic Island, be sure to check out our Patreon page in the video description below. And finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.